Welcome to yet another Photography Simplified video. My name's Chris, and in these videos, I do my best to simplify photography for you with the goal of helping you to get out and take great photos. Today, we're covering camera modes, what they are, when to use which, and the pros and cons of the different modes. Now that we've discussed the exposure triangle, and if you're not familiar with that, please check that video out. It's time to discuss the camera modes and what modes control which elements of the exposure triangle. To begin, there are semi-automatic and automatic camera modes. An automatic camera mode is one where the camera is setting most, if not all, of the settings automatically for you, eliminating the work, but it may not always do the best job. That's where the semi-automatic modes come in handy, where you can set maybe one or some of the settings, letting the camera decide the rest. And this will help you to get a good exposure while still giving you some control over those key elements of the exposure triangle. Every camera will come with an automatic camera mode. The icon may vary depending on your brand, but in most popular brands, you'll see a green icon indicating the auto mode. In this mode, the camera settings are decided for you, eliminating your work. All you have to do is simply point and click wherever you want to take a picture of. There also may be a no flash automatic mode. This is useful because sometimes when you're in automatic mode, if your camera doesn't think there's enough light, it may pop up the flash on top of the camera. This can create an effect you may not want in your images, so using the no flash automatic mode will eliminate that flash from popping up while keeping the rest of the settings in fully automatic. Most cameras will also have some scene-specific automatic modes. These are useful for a given shooting situation, such as maybe portraits or landscapes. Let's look at some examples of common scene-specific automatic modes. Remember, in these modes, the camera is still deciding all the settings for you. They're just more tailored to the given scene or subject matter. As an example, most cameras will have a portrait mode. This will make the settings focus on having a more blurred background to bring focus to the subject. Everything will be decided automatically, but focusing on creating that effect for a portrait. They may also have a macro mode, which could be good for close-up shots of things as well as blurring the background. Another common scene-specific automatic mode is landscape mode. This will make sure that the camera uses a wider depth of field to make sure that the whole scene you're photographing from the front to the back is in focus. Another common automatic scene-specific mode is sports mode. This will make sure that the camera uses a fast enough shutter speed to freeze action. Another common one may be a night portrait mode, which will take a slower shutter speed image along with the flash to make sure that the subject is lit up at night. Here are some examples of the scene-specific automatic modes on my Canon camera. Now, automatic modes can be helpful, but they also have their cons. The good thing about them is it takes the decision-making out of your hands. You can just point and shoot. You can maybe use one of the scene-specific modes and just hope for the best and take images. The downside is sometimes the camera is going to get it wrong, or it may not expose how you're wanting to expose. This is where it's better to change some of the settings yourself. Let's get into now the semi-automatic camera modes, which will give you a little more control, starting with Aperture Priority mode. Aperture Priority mode lets you choose an aperture, and then the camera will choose an appropriate shutter speed to expose your scene correctly. It may also choose an ISO if you have your ISO set to auto. You can identify Aperture Priority mode on your camera by looking for an A representing aperture, or on Canon cameras, an AV representing aperture value. Aperture Priority mode is useful when you want to focus on depth of field. If you want a shallow depth of field for something like a portrait or a large depth of field for something like landscape photography, you can use Aperture Priority mode to set an aperture to get the depth of field that you want and let the camera decide the rest of the settings to expose your scene correctly. Let's look at an example of using Aperture Priority mode with my camera. What this mode will let me do is choose the aperture that I need for whatever scene I'm shooting. If I'm doing a portrait, I may want a very wide aperture to get a shallow depth of field. If I'm shooting a landscape, maybe I want a more narrow aperture to get a larger depth of field. I can set the aperture where I want on this camera by either selecting the aperture on the back screen and changing it, or by using the scroll wheel on the top of my camera. Once I've selected the aperture that I want, I can point at my scene, lightly press the shutter button, and you can see now my camera has taken a look at the scene and decided on an appropriate shutter speed. In this case, 1/13 of a second to get the exposure that I need. If I were to change my aperture to something different, the camera will have to choose a new shutter speed to get the right exposure based off of the difference in light now that I'm using a different aperture. Now you can see that it's saying I need a 3-second exposure. One thing you can do as well is you can let the camera decide the ISO. If I change my ISO to auto, now the camera will choose both a shutter speed and an ISO to expose the scene correctly based off of whatever aperture I set. With shutter priority mode, you set the shutter speed and then the camera will choose an appropriate aperture to expose your scene correctly. It can also set the ISO again if your ISO is set to auto. You can identify shutter priority mode on your camera by looking for an S, standing for shutter priority, or if you're on a Canon camera, looking for TV, which stands for time value. Shutter priority can be useful when you want to either freeze or blur motion. Remember that the shutter speed will affect whether you're capturing motion blur or not. So, if you're doing something like wildlife or sports or fast action, shutter priority may be the best camera mode to use because you can set the shutter speed to be fast enough to freeze the action you're shooting and let the camera decide an aperture or an ISO that is useful to expose the scene correctly while still keeping the shutter speed that you need. Let's look at an example using my camera of shutter priority mode. We can set the shutter speed to whatever we may need for our scene. If I'm shooting handheld or maybe some sports, I may want a faster shutter speed. Once I've set my shutter speed where I want it, I can lightly press the shutter button, and now my camera is deciding I need an aperture of f5 and an ISO of 400 to expose my scene correctly at that shutter speed. If I were to change my shutter speed and do it again, now it's saying I only need an ISO of 320. If I didn't want my ISO to be changed, I can move it off of auto, and now my camera will only adjust the aperture depending on whatever shutter speed I set in order to expose the scene correctly. Shutter priority can be useful if you want to either use an intentional slow shutter or a fast shutter to freeze some sort of action and let the camera decide on the rest of the settings to make sure you get your scene exposed correctly. When you're shooting in either aperture or shutter priority modes, you can use exposure compensation if the camera is getting the exposure just a little bit off. If you want it to be slightly brighter or darker than the camera is calculating for, what you can do is just on my camera, under the shutter setting or the aperture setting, depending on which mode you're in, is the exposure compensation. And I can say that I want my photo to be either a little bit brighter or darker than the camera is currently doing, and it will adjust the settings accordingly so that way my end photo will be slightly darker without having to change either my aperture or shutter speed. There are some pros and cons of using the semi-automatic camera modes of aperture priority and shutter priority. You have more control over those artistic elements of the exposure triangle. You can really focus on your depth of field with aperture priority mode or on freezing action with shutter priority mode and let the camera get the exposure correct. But the downside is you do not have complete control over your camera settings. And that is where manual mode is going to come in handy. But first, if this video is helpful to you so far, please leave a like and consider subscribing to see future videos that will help you in learning photography. Check out my full playlist of Photography Simplified if you want to see other beginner tutorials. Now, let's get into manual mode. Manual mode will give you complete control over all of your camera's settings. You choose the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. The camera doesn't decide any of them for you. You have complete control over the exposure triangle, the exposure of your image, and the artistic elements of the exposure triangle as well. To identify manual mode on your camera, look for the N, standing for manual. To use manual mode, remember that you need to have a clear understanding of the exposure triangle and how it works, the artistic trade-offs of each element of the exposure triangle, as well as how they affect exposure. If you want to understand that better, check out my exposure triangle video. Let's look at an example now of using manual mode on my camera. You'll see that manual mode lets us change all of the camera settings. We can choose a shutter speed. We can choose the aperture we want, as well as the ISO. You can leave the ISO on auto, or you can select an ISO yourself. Now, one thing that I love to do in manual mode especially, this does work in the other camera modes as well, is to use my camera's live view. If I hit this button with that white icon of the camera there, it will switch to live view. Now, most modern cameras will have exposure simulation, which will adjust the image on the back screen to represent more or less how the scene is going to be exposed with the settings that you're using. This helps me to know when I change something if I'm going to make my image darker or lighter, and I can adjust accordingly to get the exposure that I want of my scene. Once I feel like my settings have a proper exposure, I can then take the image, review it, and see if it's to my liking and tweak anything if necessary. Just like the other camera modes, there are some pros and cons to using manual mode. The pros are obviously that you have complete control over all of the camera settings. However, this can also be a con. It can be more technical and difficult, and may even take you more time to get your exposure right if you're not used to using your camera in manual mode. There are two other camera modes we want to mention in this video that are creative modes. The first is program mode. You can identify program mode on your camera by looking for the P standing for program. You can also think of program mode as ISO priority. In program mode, you choose the ISO you want, and then the camera will choose an aperture and a shutter speed. You can shift more or less the aperture and shutter speed using the settings in program mode, but the main focus is you set the ISO where you want it. The other creative camera mode is bulb mode. This mode allows you to use longer shutter speeds or to determine the exact length of your shutter speed by using the shutter button. Here's an example of bulb mode using my camera. Bulb mode allows me to control exactly how long the shutter is open for when I'm taking a photo. When I push the shutter button down, it will start the photo and open the shutter, and once I release, it will then stop. To not shake my camera, it's useful to use a remote shutter release. When I push this down, it will start, and when I stop it, it will open again. I can make it as short or as long as I need it to be in bulb mode, which gives me complete control of the timing of the shutter. If you find this content helpful, you may also find my book, Photography Simplified, helpful as well. If you would like a visual beginner's guide to photography, check out my book, Photography Simplified, available in both paperback and ebook format on Amazon. The book covers topics including exposure and the exposure triangle, sharpness and focus, gear, composition, editing, and more. It even includes a list of beginner tips. There are helpful graphics to explain each of the topics that are covered in the book. I've put a lot of work into this book to include everything I wish I could have known when I started out. If you think the book could be helpful to you and haven't already, check the link in the description for more information. As a recap, let's go over the different camera modes and the amount of control that they give you over the camera settings. Remember that the fully automatic camera modes give you very little control as the camera decides all the settings for you. You may use one of the scene-specific modes to get a little more control, but otherwise the camera is doing all of the work for you. Program mode gives you a little more control than the fully automatic modes because you can set the ISO. However, the camera is still going to decide the aperture and the shutter speed for you and takes that control away from you. If you want a little more control over the artistic elements, we have the semi-automatic camera modes of Aperture Priority and Shutter Priority. And if we want complete control or the most control of all of our camera settings, we can use manual mode. Hopefully this has been helpful to you. And one tip that you might want to know is that if you have your ISO set in auto for aperture or shutter priority mode, you can set a limit of how high the camera allows that ISO to go when set to auto in your camera settings. Hopefully this video has been helpful to you. And remember that there may be more camera modes than we've covered in this video on your camera. For instance, my Canon camera lets me set a C1 or C2 camera mode, which is saved settings for either one. You might have individual camera modes specific to your camera model, which you can look at in your camera manual if you need to see what other modes may be available. Thanks for watching.